all of these great black leaders for the first 150 years of our history were major restrictionists. It was about the numbers with them. And a lot of times they said, W. Du Bois said, I feel bad about telling the Negro from the Caribbean that we don't want them to keep coming. But it's hard on us black Americans.
Yeah.
There's too many. I think this is the most important thing to me, is to look at who's losing. Because people do win through high immigration, but if the people who are losing are the people who have the least to lose, we really ought to take a major look at that. And that's what Barbara Jordan said.
The Commission has concluded that a properly regulated system of legal immigration is in the national interest of the United States. When immigrants are less well-educated and less skilled, they may pose economic hardships for the most vulnerable of Americans.
If she had been victorious in the 1990s in the legislation she had recommended, we'd be living in such a different country today.
Yeah.
I mean, in so many ways, but especially we would not have anything like this income disparity. I don't believe we would. And I don't believe that we would have so much kind of racial tension and kind of nonsense in a way, parts of it. And I'll say, and the reason is, she proposed as chair of a bipartisan joint congressional presidential commission, 1996, reductions in legal immigration back to where they were in the 80s. Not something wild, but just back where they were in the 80s.
The most urgent immigration problem we face today is the unauthorized entry of hundreds of thousands of illegals. That undermines our commitment to legal immigration.
So you could say she was kind of an American first person before Trump. Now she was a little different than Trump because she was a woman, she was black, she was liberal, she was Democratic.
Yeah.
She came from a very poor background in Houston, but the boomers know that she exploded on the scene in the TV proceedings of the Watergate. And she went on, as she was a congresswoman, she was the first descendant of slavery to give the address at a presidential convention. She gave it for Carter, and she gave it for Clinton. So an incredibly important person in black American history, for sure. And then Clinton nominated her, or chose her, to head this immigration commission. That commission made recommendations, and as I said at the beginning, those recommendations would have really transformed who we are today in America.
What was her primary justifications for wanting to radically reduce immigration?
Tightening the labor market. That was her top issue. That the increases of the 1990 Congress had so inflated the labor supply that the people, particularly at the bottom, just were having a horrible time. And she was not, so she wanted to reduce immigration from, in the 90s it ran about 1 million a year, which is basically what it's run legally ever since. And her recommendations would have brought it down to about 550,000. I just want to put that into some perspective. Before 1965, when mass immigration was restarted, immigration was running between 200 and 300,000 a year. By the 80s, it was about 500,000 a year. And in 1990, boosted up. She wanted to take it back about halfway, and to take it back to where it had been before 1965, which was more merit-based, not so family-based. The number one way she would have reduced immigration was to end chain migration. Chain migration is you bring family members other than your minor children and spouse.
Do you know how much personally familiar she was with a lot of the history you lay out in your book about how there had been a lot of important members of the civil rights movement that had noticed the wage depression effects of what they would term excessive migration? Do you know if she knew that? Did she quote it? Did she reference it?
That's a great question. And off the top of my head, I don't think I know the answer to that. It's a good one. I want to look into that some more. She was an interesting major African American leader in that she did not specialize in black issues. In other words, I don't know what Glenn Loury thinks about Barbara Jordan, but she reminds me of Glenn Loury. And, you know, and her deal was, I'm concerned about all Americans who aren't getting on that first rung of the ladder. I'm concerned for all people that are working hard and not making it. But she did have things to say at times, very specifically. You know, I want a black child that's growing up in the inner city of Houston, she said, to have the opportunity to go as far as that person is capable of going. You know, that kind of thing. And she said the Hispanic girl in the barrio of Los Angeles. She had those she would say that occasionally, but mainly she was just talking about all Americans. It was a class. She was very classy about class.
Yeah.
But so I don't know, but it would surprise me that she didn't, because she was such a student, and she knew her history, but I don't remember her saying much about it. But I noted in the book that when she delivered her messages to Congress, she was the personification of A. Philip Randolph and Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass. I mean, all of these great black leaders for the first 150 years of our history were major restrictionists, and they were restrictionists like she was. Never, I haven't been able to find in any of the writings and speeches of those black leaders, nor have I found it in Barbara Jordan, any kind of what you call demonization of immigrants or putting them down. It was always about them, was about the numbers. Of course, I like to talk about the numbers. I have an organization called NumbersUSA, but it was about the numbers with them. And a lot of times they said, Du Bois said, I feel bad about telling the Negro from the Caribbean that we don't want them to keep coming. But it's hard on us black Americans.
Yeah.
There's too many.
Yeah, so what was Frederick Douglass's experience with mass migration?
Well, those who know some black history, and of course just about every black American does, but Frederick Douglass was born a slave across the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, and he became very, very famous because he was as far as I know, the first African American to write a book, publish a book, and about what it was like to be in slavery, to escape from slavery. He was rented out, like a lot of slaves were, to a relative of his owner, a relative that lived in Baltimore. And then that relative he had Frederick Douglass around to do some chores and stuff, but mainly he rented him out to the shipbuilders. And the deal was everything that Frederick Douglass made he was a caulker on the ships at Fells Point. And so everything he made, he turned over to his master. His master had to feed him and clothe him. That was the deal. Mm-hmm. So what was happening in the 1820s was that the immigration in terms of large numbers had just started in the 1820s. It was primarily Irish and German. And those immigrants were predominant on the docks, the shipbuilding docks of Baltimore. At the same time, they were hearing more and more abolition activism coming from the pulpits and from newspapers, you name it, even in Baltimore. And they knew, they may not have known the numbers, but they knew there were millions of black slaves in Maryland and south of there. And if they were ever freed, they'd be up there competing with them.
Yeah.
And so so what you find in history is that the immigrants tended to have excessively negative, hostile attitudes about black workers. Now, on those at Fells Point, there were free blacks and there were slaves. In the end, the immigrants persuaded the owners to fire all of the free blacks by saying, we will not work beside a free black. But they were willing to work around the slaves until some things got tighter. It's all about loose labor markets. The loose labor markets make things tougher. And once it was between you or me, the immigrants chose themselves, and they attacked him violently. So he learned real early what loose labor markets did, and he never developed, I would say, a hostile attitude toward immigrants his whole life. But he saw it, and he moved to New York, he moved to the Northeast. He just saw it his whole life, and he wrote about it all up and down the line. You know, whenever he'd see black barbers, there was a time when almost everybody in these northern cities were black barbers, and then they became white immigrant barbers. And so he saw all of that, and he wrote about it along the way. Now, sometimes he wrote what looked like very pro-immigration things. After the Civil War, he wrote some pretty famous things about the Chinese. He said, these Chinese immigrants they're hardworking. Yes, they're very different from us, but I have no doubt that America's assimilation process can assimilate them, and they will be valuable. But within about 2 or 3 years in his newspaper, he was going, enough. The labor markets are full, and the descendants of slavery and the freed slaves are at the back of the line. Of course, that's why I named my book Back of the Hiring Line, because it just, there is a race preference among many people. It may be subconscious, it may be conscious, but black Americans tend to be put at the back of the hiring line. You get a long hiring line, it's bad for black Americans.
And let me do one more to skip around a little bit.
Don't mind.
Who is George Borjas, and what has he found about immigration?
Well, George Borjas is a Cuban immigrant, and he became pretty well known in the late 80s, 1980s, and particularly in the 90s. He wrote a book, I believe it came out in 1990, that was about what's the effect of immigration on wages. He's a labor economist. Now, most economists who talk about immigration are not labor economists. And it's just, it's like engineering. It's like, an electrical engineer, he's an engineer, but she may not know as much about, civil engineering or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Or nuclear engineering. But he's a labor economist. And his book that came out said, there's a lot of, there's some winners, there's some losers, there's some gains, some losses. It's kind of, the book was sort of like it's a bit of a draw on what mass immigration is doing to the country and the labor market. And he was quite celebrated at the time. But then the Census Bureau's data came out, and within about 2 or 3 years, he was using much newer data. And of course, the real mass immigration hadn't really kicked in until the early 80s. And it had gone from about 300,000 to well over maybe 550,000 by the late 80s. What he found in the later data was, it makes a difference once the numbers get up. And so ever since, all of his studies have shown that mass immigration at the level we have it is a tremendous income transfer program. But the opposite of what liberals and Democrats want to do.
Yeah.
It transfers from the owners of capital. Transfers from low-wage workers to the owners of capital. And he does calculations that shows that there's a kind of a small overall addition to the wealth of the country, but that primarily there's about $500 billion. This is in today's terms, about $500 billion transfer from the wages of lower skilled workers into the owners of capital. And of course the immigrants do great, because the immigrants wouldn't come here unless they did a lot better here than they do elsewhere. And as Frederick Douglas or Barbara Jordan would say, not their fault. I mean, good for them. That's what, especially the ones who've come illegally. They've taken advantage of an opportunity. It's been great for immigrants, but it's not been good for native-born Americans that primarily don't have college degrees. So Borjas has been the leader of that. Now, some people act like he's by himself. He's not. There's a huge amount of literature, but most of these labor economists don't really want to go on C-SPAN or MSNBC and defend themselves. But it's out there, the literature. And this is I think this is the most important thing to me, is to look at who's losing. Because people do win through high immigration, but if the people who are losing are the people who have the least to lose, we really ought to take a major look at that. And that's what Barbara Jordan said. That's what that bipartisan commission said, and what really one major Academy of Sciences and federal survey after another have found, study, is that we really have to recalibrate immigration so that it doesn't hurt the people at the bottom of the ladder. Now, Borjas, by the way, he's not suffered the way some people have suffered in the academy.
Yeah.
He hasn't been kicked out, and he's not been silenced, but he's certainly not been promoted.
You think so? You think that he's...
When I mean promoted, I mean...
like promoting the findings.
They haven't put him out there to try to get him on TV all the time and all of that kind of thing.
He's a spokesperson for Harvard.
Yeah.
You know, the question I really want to ask, again, on this issue, I don't find myself really having strong opinions, other than having gravitated steadily away from a kind of utopian borderlessness of my libertarian youth, right? So we've come a long way from there. I'm not sure I'm Numbers USA approved.
I don't think you're any longer a utopian. I've watched some of your videos.
Yeah, no kidding. And they tend the radical libertarian argument really just tends to stress the human welfare gains of migrants and how much they can improve their own personal economic well-being by coming to America and seizing opportunities here. Mm-hmm. And at least back then, my sense had been a lot of these jobs that kind of immigration restrictionists tend to underplay the importance of like cultural degradation as the reason why a lot of native-born Americans don't take these jobs. And I know I have family members that run blue-collar businesses, a lumberjack, another guy who fixes plumbing.
Oh, good.
That will, to a person, say the only reliable laborers are the Latinos, because the native-born white kids just want to vape and play Call of Duty all day, and they don't have a good work ethic, right? I'm not going to insist that we extract, hard and fast political science principles from those particular anecdotes, but that aligns with some of my thinking, at least back then, and maybe some thinking now. I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, I think you are right to point to that as being one of society's problems. I think it's a tremendous drop in American labor participation rate has a lot of causes. And I hope we can talk a little bit about the circle here, what leads to what. But there are issues, and there's issues in every racial group, every ethnic group. My biggest concern is the descendants of slavery group, because they are so much farther behind. I mean, the wealth gap, the median household wealth gap was 18-1 a year ago anyway. 18-1. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, that's nothing like the income or the wage gap. But so there's something wrong. There's something really wrong here. And the racialists might say, oh, well, what's all wrong is just black people. The black people haven't made it. They just can't cut it. And of course you say the same thing, but the white people they just can't cut it. So I guess it's not my expertise on all these other reasons why we've got this new class of people who are really kind of lacking ambition, right? I mean, in a sense, they aren't consumerist enough, are they? They're very happy at a kind of a.
They're happy to be numbed.
Yeah,
They're happy
exactly.
to be numbed.
So what has caused that? So let me try this experiment. If the labor force or the labor environment has changed since the 1960s to make it harder for Americans with less education, and generally when I say less education, I mean don't have a college degree. If it has made it harder for them to get into the labor market, to rise in the labor market, maybe survive in the labor market, then does that create a culture that you start having a critical mass of people in that arena, so that now you've got, and I focus, it's not that I'm not concerned about women, but I think our biggest problem in the country right now is the men that have dropped out. And so you've got men that don't have the example of fathers who were what do they call it? Anyway, seriously connected to the labor market. They don't have a grandfather. They may not have people in their neighborhood. There's very few men that they see that. And this is, I'm from the Missouri Ozarks, and I don't want the Ozarks watchers of your videos to get mad at me, but there is a culture in the Ozarks that is, it used to be about just drinking beer and fishing and getting by as little as you could, and then it was marijuana, and
now it's fallen into the abyss of fentanyl.
Yeah, it's so there, it's, you can just find it in every part of society, that dropping out, and part of this is you just don't. Boys get out of high school, or maybe they don't get out of high school, and there aren't jobs there that they can imagine. So, what caused all that? Well, here's one thing that happened that we do know, and that is these are government statistics that from the time that mass immigration was restarted in 1965 until the year 2000, which is just after Congress turned down Barbara Jordan's recommendations, the median white male income had dropped 20%, real income. And the real median income for black males had dropped 32%. And for the people who did not have a college degree, it's even worse. Now, that made jobs a lot. I grew up in the 60s. I paid every penny of my college expenses at a state university, every penny, with summer jobs and working 15 hours a week while I was going to college. I could do it then. It's really not possible now to do that. But just think about when and we're not talking about the very bottom job. We're talking about the very bottom jobs, but quite a ways up. If you've got that much of a decline in the real value of work, it's going to drive a lot of people out of the labor market.
Yeah.
And you bring immigrants in who those wages look pretty good.
Can you speak to how much the economic legacy of the Trump administration does or does not substantiate some of the observations you've made about immigration policy affecting wages, particularly for, let's say, young males?
Well, I'm a journalist, and journalist sounds a lot like generalist. Not an expert, but we journalists, what we do is we look for the experts. Steve Camerata over at the Center for Immigration Studies did quite an interesting study of the effects of the reduced immigration under Trump. A lot of it was kind of accidental, but it did happen. There was a significant decrease in legal immigration, and there probably was a decrease in illegal, but there was a big boost in illegal immigrants leaving the country. That's how the illegal population dropped, was leaving the country. So there's just enough, I guess, the Trumpism made being illegal in this country just uncomfortable enough, harder maybe to make a living,
Yeah.
that people did leave. The trouble is that you're really talking about maybe a 2-year period before the pandemic happened. So, nonetheless, he did find that there was a significant bump in wages. And I can't explain how he fathomed that that tighter labor market was the reason, and that immigration. Well, actually, the numbers are there. Reduced immigration did tighten the labor market, but it's an awfully short period. Now, what we know, and this is the big the big ask in the book is for the readers to look at 3 times in history when African Americans had big boosts in their economic prosperity. The first one was they weren't slaves anymore. So 1865, but it was immediate. I mean, it was like from 1865 to 1880, there was a tremendous bump. And people say, well, of course they weren't making wages, but the economists figure out how much money was being spent on their shelter and food and clothing. So they take that as the beginning. Well, okay, mass immigration was started big time, the Great Wave, 1880. And that lasted till 1924. There was this period during World War I, which is very interesting, but I'm going to skip over that right now because it was short. But in 1924, when Congress cut legal immigration by about 2/3 overnight, 1925, it's kind of like the descendants of slavery woke up, and all of these industries in the West and in the North that were basically closed off to them during the Great Wave because the employers much preferred to bring people in from all over Europe, white workers. And they were available. So what happened? Well, the Great Migration. The Great Migration of black Southerners, 6 million. At that point, I don't think there were any former slaves. There may be a few left, but 6 million children and grandchildren of slaves. 90% of them were on the plantations or near the plantations where their ancestors had been enslaved. They're stuck in these low-skill, underemployed jobs. 90% of them in 1910, still there. And starting in 1925 to 1950, 1960, 6 million of them moved out. And they moved to those jobs. So I just think, and during that time, that was, by the way, that period was a great time for white men and white women too. Their real income during these periods rose by about 2.5-fold, 250%. But the real income of black workers rose about 400%. And there's a whole literature on how that was the building block for creating the great black intellectual class that was the foundation of the civil rights movement. Businesses began, when businesses needed black labor, they shifted over. In the end, there's an argument to be made that the civil rights laws of the 1960s would not have been passed if you had not limited immigration in the 60s. I'm getting off your topic a little bit here, but the point is that all of that is related to wage growth and labor participation. That was a great time. But since 1965, and it really started in the 1970s, there's been, first of all, stagnation. I'm not saying anything new here. There's been real wage stagnation for non-college workers. And 2/3 of all Americans don't have a college degree. So I'm not talking about some small piece of America that we're concerned about here. So I think that experiment from 1925 to 1965 should tell us there's a great hope. Now, maybe our culture has, this is where you're getting at earlier, maybe something in our culture is so changed. Maybe there's something about our way our government operates that's so changed that maybe it'll be a lot harder to bring people back into the labor force. That's what we're talking about. Isn't it crazy right now? We got, 3.5% official unemployment, and yet we have something like 50 million working age, non-institutionalized Americans who aren't working. And a good share of them.
50 million?
50 million. Working age, not working.
Just dropped out of the labor market.
Well, some of them are wealthy and whatever, right? But still, a lot of those 50 million are either poor or near poverty, or maybe they're somehow or another they've got just enough money to play their video games and whatever you're talking about. Yeah. And the government, there's enough, and that is one thing that has to be looked at. Is our income redistribution system really calibrated right to take away disincentives for working? I doubt it.
Yeah. This is a purposely large question. What right now is the current situation on the American border with Mexico?
It is so open, I could never have imagined it. I could never have imagined that the federal government, the executive branch of the federal government, would open our border like this. I mean, I've known that there was huge pressure from certain industrial groups, commercial groups, to keep the border open enough that they could have enough illegal workers. But there was always this idea that you didn't let it get totally out of control. And I mean, for the most part, I'm a pretty moderate person, but the head of the Department of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, he's a fifth columnist. I mean, we've had this invasion going on, and he's supposed to be in charge of the gates, and he's unlocking all the gates, and flying them all over the country. And I mean, what's the word to the rest of the world is, if you have to go to Chile to start your trek, you will eventually get in.
Yeah.
And if you get in, the only way you will ever have to leave is if you're convicted of first-degree murder. I mean, murder's not even enough anymore. The sanctuary city thing, that's a national sanctuary. We're a sanctuary nation now. Mayorkas won't deport even the people who've been convicted of all kinds of major crimes. So it's not surprising. It's what we've always said. Anybody who knows anything about the border knows if you reward breaking the law, lots of people will want to do it. And there are tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world who posters find say that if they could get in, they would come to the United States.
Right.
So it's, how did we get to this point? And I have to, I was a journalist for 25 years. I hate to beat up on the media, mainstream media. They're an easy target. But the mainstream media they've not censored this story, but they've basically so underplayed what's going on down there that the American people are just kind of vaguely aware of what's happening. So it's a mess, and the key things that Mayorkas did is he said, you don't have to wait in Mexico for us to decide whether your claim for asylum is totally frivolous. I mean, Trump's policy that he put in place was, it's still, if a person had just any kind of reasonable thing, they still got to come in. But most of them are just, there's nothing to them. So you had to wait there. Well, once they found out that you had to wait in Mexico until you were, and you didn't get a work permit and get sent into the interior to wait for 2 or 3 years. I mean, you could work for 2 or 3 years legally while your court case came up. Once they found out you didn't have to do that, well, excuse me, and under Trump, once they found you couldn't do that, people stopped coming for the most part. But now the word is, you come across, you get trained by folks on the other side of the border what to say, and then you're in.
So what do you make of the counter argument that I'm not totally unsympathetic to, if I don't buy it entirely, though, that it's, nationality is just a cosmic roll of the dice. We got extraordinarily lucky. I got to be born in 1980 Santa Monica, and you got to be born in the Ozarks. You got to be born in America.
That's right. I was lucky.
And which means you were born into a country with completely unprecedented amounts of freedom and opportunity and prosperity. Yeah. Most people who are born are not afforded that luck. opening borders and free immigration policies allows for a correction of that grave cosmic injustice in real time. It's perfectly, I don't know if the DHS guy would say this. I mean, if he's the true fifth column you say he is, maybe he would say I'd say at least you ought to, they still need to abide by laws and they need to become legalized and so they need to hold up their end of the bargain, but we're happy for them to radically improve their well-being amidst the bounty of the American economy, insofar as they follow the rules of the road. Most of them are not fentanyl mules. Most of them are not drug dealers. They're just desperately poor people looking for a better life. What do you make of that?
There's a lot in there. Let's start off with Mayorkas. I think you put your finger on it, of course. He's operating by a philosophy. It is a philosophy. He's a principled person. He's operating from principles he holds dear. It's just they are absolute in violation of the laws that Congress has passed. So that's the part that you're kind of pointing to. It's like there are laws, and that's the fifth columnist part of it. He's absolutely opposed to the laws of the United States when it comes to immigration. But in terms of, I absolutely agree with you. Anytime somebody brings up, in fact, I was on an interview recently when somebody brought up the rapists and all these kind of things. Says, yeah, there are a few like that, but no, people don't even come here to get into the welfare system. They come here to work. And of course, that's the focus of my work, is that they are basically wonderful people. The illegal workers. They're trying to help their families. They're doing anything. They're doing stuff that you would tend to want to do unless you had a strong sense about breaking laws. But I understand why they do it, what they do, and they work. And I believe all these employers that say, my immigrant workers, whether illegal or legal, are the hardest working people I've got. The thing is, of course, is that their children want to work and be paid and have benefits like Americans. So it's like it's a Ponzi scheme in that sense, it's only the immigrants are willing to not work like Americans and not be paid like Americans, etc. Now, this cosmic injustice, I agree. It's like this is where I think the moral person who is was lucky enough to be born in a rich country cannot be an isolationist and must be I think an internationalist. I make a big difference between globalism and internationalism, but the fact is that most of the people in the world, I mean, we could open the borders right now, but believe me, about 1 or 2 years, there's no question they would be closed once you had the millions of people flooding in. So there's only a tiny little portion who could ever get into rich countries. So does that mean that, what do you do about the rest of the world? And the issue is like, it's the rest of the world that needs to be taken care of. And generally, it's not money distribution, it's a change of systems and cultures. And I had a friend that retired from the federal government and went to work for the UN, and his big job was to work with these third world countries to try to help them have procurement systems. A system in which somebody would actually ship you something because you ordered it, because they knew that you would pay for it. There's things like that have to change. So there's a lot of help that's needed. So the other part of this is that I was kicked back against that philosophy, is that it totally ignores an idea of national culture, of national societies. And I'm a huge believer in the nation state, and that it's been, not every wonderful thing of modern society was made possible by the nation state, but an awful lot of it was. And once you've got where people, it's in the nation state that diverse people can kind of operate, because you've got to think that people say, oh, you're talking about us versus them, but unless there's a feeling about us, some kind of larger us, you can't have social safety nets, you can't have much of anything. So,
or you can't have civic society, which is essential.
And by the way, speaking of libertarianism, I do know that a couple of the major minds behind modern libertarianism in the 50s did have the mantra that was that they were for free trade, free movement of goods over borders, but they said that free movement of labor was a disaster. And of course, you had others who said you can't have open immigration and a major welfare system at the same time. So, but I think,
guys, on that though, I that's honestly the thing that has made me move away from the utopianism and open border dreams, is more the cultural argument, the idea that America has this majestic, very special kind of cultural operating software. It's the American creed, it's an American ethos, and it's connected also to a shared set of like folkways, I guess what they would say. Certain cultural rhythms and shared historical reference points and shared idols, and that is absolutely essential to what made America the most successful, experiment in self-governance in the history of the Homo sapiens species, right? And so on one hand, I see that, and the kind of unfiltered, particularly illegal immigration, I do think has degrading qualities to that, particularly when the immigrants kind of self-isolate. And again, I told you my mom is a physician in Los Angeles. I mean, I grew up in LA, and there's gigantic pockets there where there's multiple generations of people that basically still don't speak English. Or they really do not integrate with the rest of society or adopt those cultures and creeds and folkways that are essential to having a unified civic body. But on the other hand, and then I'll let you respond, there is that Ellis Island thing, and you talk about it in your book, but it is awesome. Like, I read this book about the Statue of Liberty and, the Irish and the Scandinavians and the Nigerians coming to the feet of this totem of human liberty and the creed, and that it's accessible to anyone regardless of the color of their skin or nationality. It is awesome. Like, it's amazing. And that's it's excellence plus diversity wrapped in this particular American cultural software is amazing, and it's very unique, and it's a miracle in human history. So I'm not saying I have a way to square those two things together, but I wonder what you make of that.
well, what you just described is amazing, and I think that it's likely that our creed, our history, all kinds of things, the fact that we had open spaces, not as open as we like to pretend it was, but nonetheless, all of that played into something very special, and I think is the reason why we were able to do something that almost nobody else could do. I mean, yes, there are some multicultural societies in America, in the world that work, but they're very small. Multiculturalism is very, very hard to hold together, and of course, multiculturalism is a much bigger issue than multi-ethnic or multiracial. Yeah. But here's the thing that I try to point out in my book, is that for all of us who had relatives that came during that great wave during the Ellis Island period, it didn't work. Most immigrants were living in extreme poverty. The commissions that studied this about 10 years before they cut the immigration way down, they found that the levels of immigrants that were in the poorhouse and insane asylums that had terrible diseases, that it was too many. It was just too much. And of course, what tends to be when people study immigration, they rarely look at, well, what about the people who are already here? Just like we look at the beginning of this country, what about the Indians? What about the indigenous who are here? We're finally kind of paying a little more attention to that. Yeah. So what made the Ellis Island story so wonderful is what happened after 1924. At that point, it wasn't, most of those gains of whites that I was mentioning earlier were immigrants. They were white immigrants who finally had a tight enough labor market that they could form unions that could actually negotiate. And it wasn't all about unions, but unions were a big part of this. It was after you stopped the huge flows through Ellis Island that all the people who had come through Ellis Island began to have a chance to become Americans. So that's the, rose-colored glasses. Let's remove those. But I also try. I think I've done a pretty good job of constantly reminding us, none of this takes away from whatever story we may have about our pioneering ancestors. They were brave and courageous and hardscrabble, and the fact that their numbers were so great that their presence really did hurt some major groups of Americans, especially the descendants of slavery, not their fault. And it doesn't take away from the joy of that, nor does it take away from the fact that we were probably very special, that even after the 20s and 30s, we were able to assimilate. I do want to say something else, though, about kind of the specialness about America, and that is there are countries all over this world that also have long histories and cultures, and they've ended up doing pretty well. Now, I think most of them have really benefited from what our founders got started and proved that you could have some kind of a democratic republic with a large country, large population. But the Swedes and the Danes and the French and the Italians and the Hungarians, they all have things that they're proud of their history, their cultures, and they have a right to have their cultures and preserve their histories and feel like that the people in that country are themselves. I mean, if the Japanese want to be Japanese and not anybody else, do they really have to take the poor of the world, or is there moral obligation to the poor of the world to help people outside? I mean, it could be either way, but I think helping people in their own countries is certainly at least as fair of a moral response to the luck of being born in a rich country.
Yeah. Like the idea of the nation is not some antiquated white supremacist idea or whatever the latest,
right,
kind of globalist denunciation
right.
of the nation is, it actually fits with something about the human character and how we form identity in a sense of place and purpose. We have to be situated within a nation, and it needs to have very clearly delineated cultures and folkways and borders and a sense of citizenship, and also that requires non-citizens. There's people who are not citizens that you don't have those same unique obligations to. Can we talk about you as a viral internet star? Most famously, the Gumball video, which there's only an updated version of it now. The original one, I don't know where it is. I don't know what happened to it. But I feel like that was one of the, just from a media perspective, it felt like it was one of the earlier viral political videos.
It was.
And do you feel like your old friends will testify to the fact that kind of fame changed you or warped you in any way?
Well, if I monetized it, it might have changed me.
Damn. Damn.
We have, my staff has through the years tried to find all the different places it's been posted. Most of the views have not been on our posting; they've been elsewhere. But so far, they've come up close to 200 million views. 200 million. Back in when was this? When was the big Syrian refugee crisis that started? But that year, all of a sudden, somebody said something's happening on Facebook. We're seeing something like 20 million more views in the last. It's not ours. It says somebody's posted a new one, and all of a sudden it's got 20 million views. From nothing to 20 million in about 3 days or 3 weeks or whatever.
Yeah.
And it turned out it was a truck driver in England who traveled all over Europe, and that was his job. And apparently he was something of a Facebook aficionado and had a following. And that Syrian thing was going on, and he posted that thing. And it just went crazy. And all in all, I think he had over 40 million views by the time he finished. So it was amazing. Well, we put the thing up as a video in '96. and it was first on Google videos,
Yeah.
and then YouTube came along, and then incorporated, and then in 2010 we did the new one.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing how little I've aged through the years. It's one reason why I may not want to do an update.
Yeah.
I've just been told that the best way to get viral videos is to not have people, but to have kind of characters.
Characters,
like Prager
cute
does.
animals. Yeah.
So I think my career is over. But it is amazing. I mean, even back in the late '90s, we were amazed to get up to 2 or 3 million views. So that showed and that was early. So '96, started, and it was. I've not done a lot of writing, but I've written 5 public policy books. I've been published in lots of journals, lots of newspapers. In other words, I think of myself as a writer, but if I'm ever recognized anywhere, hey, aren't you the Gumballs man?
The Gumballs, man. Didn't monetize it though. Damn.
But you hear this from people who write music. It's like they write a hit song, but they can't write another one. It's just like you just caught it in a bottle.
Yeah.
And I hear this same thing about.
Nobody
in
knows.
your business, huh?
Nobody
how do you
knows.
make it? How do you get something that just totally goes viral? It just happens, but I think you can analyze what's going on there though, and that is that Gumballs video is taking advantage that most people are innumerate. They can't picture numbers and comparisons, and so it uses these gumballs to so you can say, okay, this is what we're taking as immigration, but here's one gumball, but here's 5,000 gumballs of people who are poor, etc. And I think it does give people permission to go ahead and believe what they want to believe, which is that most Americans over the last 30 years ago, I don't want to have this much immigration. For all kinds of reasons. It may be cultural, it may be about economics, and for some people it's about race. It's about all kinds of things. But I'm really referring to the people who really have pretty good motives, but they're also told we have a moral obligation to help people who want to be helped, these people are poor, etc.
Yeah.
And so the video, I think, is taken off because people go, wait a minute, this isn't really the way to do it,
Yeah.
It sort of gives them permission. I think that's the reason it took off. I don't really think it's my stellar presentation.
Come on now, you got the presentation.
By the way, I also have a charts video that has several million that just talks about the population growth in this country and what immigration is part of it is. But all of that was stuff that I developed when one of my sons was a 7th grader. Here in Arlington, Virginia, and they had 2 weeks every year where kids could volunteer their parents to come in and teach an hour. And so I think I was in a science class actually, but I tried to come up with something to sort of show them how numbers could work, and I wondered would it work with 7th graders. And by the way, the majority of students in that class were children. Were either immigrants or children of immigrants. That's always been one of my thoughts is that I've always lived around immigrants. I've always had, been in church with immigrants. I've done, immigrants have been around me, and I thought, I've got to talk about this in a way that it's not different with people who are immigrants. That's the important thing. That's part of keeping the humanity. But anyway, I do think that that's part of the secret too. Developed it for 7th graders, and therefore the American public might be able to.
Oh, great. Yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Glenn Loury, and he's probably the most powerful articulator I've heard against the idea that to be a dutiful black voter, you have to believe in open borders.
Oh, yeah.
And he's very good at, I don't know if he has any explicit policy prescriptions, but I mean, I've heard him say in his podcasts, like, here are the numbers in terms of wage gains under the Trump administration. They seem to have been somewhat attributable to tighter labor markets.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that he's instantly racially obligated to sort of ignore inconvenient facts like those, right, and adopt open border maximalism? But I guess in your work, how do you, I mean, there's going to be a public perception inevitably that a project like NumbersUSA has some racial element to it, right? And obviously this book is in part an attempt to kind of combat that perception. I mean, is it working? What do you think? What messages tend to work? Do you think there is somewhat of a silent majority of like people of color that are skeptical of immigration maximalism, but that don't say anything because they know, like, to be a card-carrying member of the Democratic Party, they have to say whatever AOC says about immigration? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Of course, the big tool on this issue and a lot of other issues is you have an unstated agenda going on. I have some of the funniest stuff that's been written about me on some of the open borders groups, and I don't use open borders loosely. They are open borders. Most of them, I'd say, are immigration expansionist groups. Are that I've never said or written anything or done anything that would suggest racism, and that's why I'm so dangerous, because I'm hiding the fact that it is all about white supremacy. It's like
that's the most effective way to get it. Yeah.
It just kind of reminds me of the Crucible, in the play where the husband is trying to save, this one husband is trying to save his wife, and says she's never done anything, she's never said anything, there's nothing that would say that she is the things that you're saying, and they go, yeah, but it's in her heart. Yeah, and so there's no defense against that, and I just think it's a ridiculous kind of way to go, where you're saying that somehow or another what you do and say is not what's important. But I will say this: that this book was written on the back of 2 chapters of a book I wrote for W.W. Norton in 1996. So this is not a new project. I did a kind of a short history and did work with some of this in '96, but it was the 2000 unrest in the cities across America that really said, I got to get back on this, and that I feel, because you had the police incidents, but a tinder that ends up burning communities is hopelessness, and all so related to the low workforce participation, et cetera.
Yeah.
So, that's.
But you're saying that you think the immigration policies end up eradicating job opportunities for people in this country, which inevitably leads to sort of sustained unemployment. You maybe couple that with sustained COVID lockdowns, and that's what leads to this kind of social disruption.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, people who have a full-time job and are supporting their family and stuff don't burn their neighborhoods down. I mean, and I'm not saying that's all that happened there. I mean, you've had provocateurs and everything like that. But the fact is, we've got a terrible situation in this country, and even if I were to concede, which I won't, but there's an argument that could be that some of my business friends that go, it's like, but still, why should I hire people, that have no history of work, of paid work from the inner city here, when I have these very, very eager immigrants of whatever color. Many of them are black, of course. They're from the Caribbean or from Africa. And the answer is, for you, no, it doesn't make sense. But what about for the country? What are we going as a country if we just continue to paper over this problem? use immigration to sort of paper over the issue that we can't persuade our own people to do our own work. I think we're going to fall apart that way.
Right.
And
that happens at the elite end too. I think it might have been you retweeting something from Eric Weinstein, or there was something about this idea that on the elite end, the companies that use like H-1B programs, they're like, we'd much rather just import a flood of PhDs from Asia than having to train up,
right,
particularly like black applicants. I think I feel like there was something like that got leaked, or someone said that in what they thought was a closed door meeting, and the veil quickly came off and it got reported. That seems to be essentially the mentality. Also at the higher end of the labor market, that they feel no obligation to train up local workers. They just want the most maximally efficient solution to their staffing problems.
Yeah, and so the other part of this is that in terms of the cost of the country, if you were able to hire a non-employed American of any race who's been out of the labor market a long time, that person's been sucking up societal resources and producing nothing. That person will start producing again and no longer be, well, of course, they're still going to have to make about $60,000 a year before they're not sucking up public resources. But nonetheless, but still, you're reducing it, okay? Now, if you bring in if instead you leave them as a non-employed, bring in somebody else, they will do, the production will be there. It may even be a little better. But you've now got to provide all the infrastructure for them. With the non-employed person, that person's already here. You already have to have education facilities and streets and utilities and all the things. But you bring in new people, there is extra cost to that. So from just an economic standpoint, it's just much more conservative economically to put your own people to work. Now, it's probably important at this point to note where I and my organization stand on immigration numbers. We fought in 2018 for a bill in the House that actually had a big amnesty for the so-called dreamers and cut legal immigration from 1 million a year to about 500,000 a year. And that would have created a legal standpoint for things like remain in Mexico, that kind of thing, solve that problem. So, in other words, we're not for ending
practical,
we're not for ending immigration, but
what happened to that bill?
That bill was killed by your old friend. No, I don't know if he's your old friend or not. Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan did not support it, did not whip it, and so nearly all the Republicans voted for it, but there were about, 15, 18 Republicans. None of the Democrats supported it. Democrats are not willing, they're not interested enough in the amnesty for the dreamers to trade anything. But you had just enough Republicans in 2018 that went with Paul Ryan, and so it died.
What was his concern? He didn't like reducing legal immigration that much?
Yeah. I mean, he's a libertarian. and he really does believes in that, and he's right about this, of course. You grow the population and you bring new people in, it does grow the economy. But my concern, and I think most Americans' concerns, is what does it do to the median American? What does it do to the average American?
And this is somewhat related. There was a paper from MIT that came out that basically said in not so many words that Trump had been right about NAFTA in this sense. This is related to free trade policy, where he said overall NAFTA free trade policies, of course, are good for overall macroeconomic growth, but there are large pockets of America that lose all the jobs, get deindustrialized. There's no compensating jobs. They just get cheaper plastic items at Walmart, right? So on net, they actually do lose.
Yeah.
For educated, cognitively inclined elites, obviously it's excellent for them. Yeah. And even for like maybe middle skilled and upper middle skilled, But there is some substantial part of the country that even if macro overall it's great, they're actually not delusional when they hear Trump voice these criticisms and say that resonates with me.
Yeah.
It turns out actually these are MIT economists saying actually we got the data to back that up. I'm sure that's true with immigration as well, that there is a substantial slice of the population that has to pay the bill for everybody else to benefit from a larger overall economy.
And of course, it's very much like inflation in the sense that people say inflation is the tax that's much easier to pass in a sense that it gets spread around. But if it gets too high, obviously it becomes a real political issue. For most Americans who have influence, and even voters, they're not being hurt much by this. And to the extent they are hurt, it's hard for them to see. You know, their kid going to college may have actually less opportunity if we didn't have so much of the high immigration, the high skill immigration, for example. But unless they go head to head with somebody, they tend not to see it. At the bottom, though, and I apologize because I realized I missed a key question you asked a while ago, and that is, it really related to the descendants of slavery. Do they know this? Are they aware of this? How is it affecting them? And there are lots of communities where lots of unrest has been called one thing or another, but a lot of times it's their immigration rights in the sense that they are, if you see something exploding in the black community, often you see it's the Korean grocers and this, that, and the other thing. There's a lot of ethnic tension going on there. Sometimes it's Hispanics. And so these are, and I'm not saying that African Americans are all angels on this. I mean, this is the problem about you create, when you create situations where the competition is too great for resources, and the worst comes out in you. And I think that's what we've done in some of these poor communities. The polling shows that, and by the way, we follow polling that's done every 2 weeks on these issues. It's hardly changed over the last few years, but black voters, and the polling is only of voters, regular voters. Black voters pretty much track on almost every issue where white voters are, but slightly less restrictive. And the one place that they're really different has to do with when it comes to amnesty. They're much more for amnesty. I think that comes out of this sense of kind of a feeling of like, well, we wanted our civil rights, we want these people, whatever. But almost most of these are 2-to-1 margins. They support ending chain migration. What they say, the court's choice is, should immigrants be able to bring only spouse and minor children? And 2-to-1, yes, that should be that. Yeah. 2-to-1, should all employers be forced to use E-Verify to keep from hiring illegal workers? By 2-to-1, they want less overall immigration over more immigration, which is basically what, more immigration has been the policy of the W. Bush, the Obama, and the Biden administration. And yet, that's not where blacks are. It's not where Hispanics are either, by the way. But where you really touch the nerve is when employers say they're having a hard time finding workers. Should the government make it easier for them to bring in foreign workers to hold prices down, or should they be forced to recruit harder among non-employed Americans, even if it raises the prices of our goods? So it has that part, very heavy, of course, very heavily.
It's tough.
Yeah. So the restrictionist bent is there in everybody except most of the editorial rooms of the major newspapers.
Yeah, man,
of
that's how you
America.
get Trump 2024, man. If you keep ignoring the American people, it's like, bro.
And that's what Trump did. Is Trump broke through like a, not like just any elephant, but I've actually been to Africa and seen what happens when a juvenile elephant's acting up and the herd sends him out of the herd for a while. That's kind of the way Trump, operates. But he broke it open. He took the taboo subject and got it out there. And you mentioned Glenn Loury, what he said about it. All of these things that have been there about what this high immigration is doing, it's been out there, but it has been so the lid has been on it.
It's going to backfire.
And well, it did backfire.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump was the first
It's going to do it.
backfire.
It's going to happen again.
Yeah, and how you just can't do that forever. What I found the really good thing about the reception of my book has been in what I call black grassroots, online black grassroots, and some of them call themselves ADOS, American Descendants of Slavery. Some call themselves the freedmen is a popular term. Others are just reparations groups, but the reception has been very good in there. There's differences of opinion.
You said that's a 6-hour conversation.
Differences
with
of
people at
opinion
ADOS, right?
but what they say is, it's not that I'm telling them something they don't know. I mean, in terms of the bottom line, but it's like, especially some of the college graduates go, man, I've had so many Black history courses, but I've never heard this part of Black history.
Yeah.
And mainly they're saying, you've provided us a couple of hundred footnotes now that back up what we thought was happening anyway. And they're very happy about that, very happy to provide it. I just feel like that at some point, it did break through. We've been thinking ever since Barbara Jordan died. By the way, I didn't mention to you, you probably know this, but I want to say it for the sake of your audience. Barbara Jordan died like a month before the votes in Congress. Almost everybody thought, that the legislation that was based on her recommendations was going to pass. Clinton had totally endorsed that legislation months earlier. So, and both Senate and House had the bills to do it, end chain migration, end the lottery, go to a more merit-based system, have mandatory e-verify, although it didn't have the name then, mandatory e-verify, to stop most illegal immigration. It was not based on doing raids and the bullets and the guns and badges. It was about just using accountants, basically, and a system. But anyway, but she had diabetes, she had multiple sclerosis. All during the 5 years, I think it was, that she was the chair of that commission, she was right on the edge.
Wow.
But people didn't know it. She died, and within, a couple of weeks, Clinton withdrew his endorsement. He wouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
He would not have done that. But he did it, and the Boston Globe came out with a story on why. There was, you remember there was a little later during his second term, there was quite a controversy, scandal about selling access to the Lincoln bedroom, and there were these Hong Kong businessmen. The Hong Kong businessmen said, you cannot end chain migration. So, and that had happened so that was to me clearly. So he pulled his support, and then the Christian Coalition came out and said that this was anti-family, and came out against it, and that dropped just enough Democrats and Republicans that it narrowly lost. That's why I say everything would be different.
That's an appropriately profound way to end. I like that as a capstone for the conversation. Roy, thank you so much for coming on the channel. I really appreciate you giving us all this time. Thank you so much.
It was great fun.
Thank you.